Where the Spironis is from?
My father was born in Mani near Pyrgos Dirou
Yes.
in the southern Peloponnesus.
And your mother?
She was from the northern Peloponnesus. Well, she was born in Lowell, Massachusetts,
Yes.
but her father was from the north, and I don't recall the name of the village right now.
And where did they meet?
They met here because my father was a young doctor, and my mother's father was suffering from lung cancer. And he would come to the home in Newton to treat her dad, and that's how they met. And
Yeah.
she was 13 years younger than he. So when they first met, she was just a young teen, and as the years went by, things developed.
Well, wonderful. And then you were born?
I was born in Boston, but lived in the same home in Newton until I was 26.
And then you married?
Married James Triant, original name Triantafylakos.
Triantafylakos, yes. And you have two children?
Two children,
Two children,
Jean and Bill, and 6 grandchildren.
What are they, wonderful. What are they doing, Jean and Bill?
Jean is an infectious disease physician at Mass General Hospital, and Bill works for Pearson Educational Consulting Firm.
Wonderful. So, and you were professionally, you said you were a counselor at
And I
Wellesley?
was a career counselor at Wellesley College for some years. Then I took time off to raise a family, and then about 20 years ago I started doing some freelance writing part-time.
Well, wonderful. And tell us a little bit about your sister, Cynthia.
Yes, Cynthia was the oldest sister. Her name is Cynthia Spears Zervis. She lived in Needham with her husband Frank, who was principal of a elementary school in Newton. And she passed away 5 years ago, but she was active on a building committee here. I think the original church when it was having an addition put on. I know she was on that building committee. And the closest relationship she's had with the church is that she was the founding chair of the Philoptochos Scholarship Committee, and chaired it for many years
Which
until
is still
she
being
became
given,
ill.
yeah, the scholarship, yes. And your mother?
My mother, Athena
Athena,
Spear,
yes.
was very active in the early years of the church. She was the second president of what they called the auxiliary in those days, the Philoptochos, and was on multiple committees through the years of azure balls and whatever.
Yes. So,
And there was a third sister, Jean,
Oh, Jean.
Jean Spear Canelos, but she was living out of state for quite a while, but came back to Boston some decades ago, and she and her husband George have been parishioners for many years
Here?
too. Here,
Oh,
yes,
wonderful.
and still are.
Wonderful.
We had been parishioners at the cathedral in Boston, and I was in Sunday school there under Father Koukouzis and then Father Zanetos, and one day when I was about 12 or 13, my father came home, and he said that several of their friends, the male half of the couples, were talking about forming a new church in Newton Lower Falls. And Lee Loomis, who was one of that handful of men, had his television store in Newton Lower Falls and had heard of a village church that was for sale. So,
Was that his store that was next to the church?
yes.
Because I do remember seeing, I went to the Newton Historical Society where I saw old photographs.
Yes.
And there was a television store.
It was, and he eventually moved it out to Needham Street.
Okay.
But at that time he was there, and I think that's how they first heard that the church was for sale. And they, I'm going to look at my notes
Absolutely.
here, were, as I recall, my father mentioning Angelo Bassett, Dimitri Decaneus, Lee Loomis, John Athens,
Yeah,
and others.
we do have all these names, yes.
Yes, so then that handful grew to about 19, and my dad, who was a Dr. George Spear, was one of those original 19, And in fact, we have a medal that was given to him posthumously at the 40th anniversary, indicating
That
so.
is going to be featured in our site.
Okay.
All these pictures, yes.
And he did something nice. Cynthia and I were at home. Jean had married and was living in New York, but I was 13. Cynthia was in her 20s. So my dad, when they eventually bought the church and it began, he made us charter founders. And by that, he, pledged that we would become members of the church, and there was some sort of a financial component.
That was
but
a
that's
great
how
gesture on his part.
It was. So
for you at that age.
are charter founders at
Yes.
age 13.
Yes.
And the church, as I recall, would you like me to describe it a little bit?
Absolutely. I do know one detail.
Yes.
It had no middle aisle.
No, it didn't.
So that's why we have two, at least that I know of, who got married not there, but in the cathedral because there was no middle aisle. Okay.
The sanctuary, well, first of all,
Yes.
it was a little village church with a spire, the
Yes.
type you would see a couple of centuries ago. There was one room
It was
for
the
the sanctuary.
Newton Wesley Methodist Church at the time.
Okay.
Yes.
See, I didn't remember what
Yes.
it had been before. There was one room, and there were pews on 3 sides of a square, and the 4th side was the altar, and behind the last row was the candle stand, and that was the sanctuary. Then there was some very steep steps leading down to a basement that was finished, a very large room with a stage at one end, where all the coffee hours, meetings, events would be held in the early days. And then you'd walk out to a little driveway parking lot, and behind the parking lot was a large white house that I think must have been the parish house originally. And in that house is where various events would take place. And one of them was Sunday school. So I was in the first Sunday school, and we were like 13 to 16 years old.
Do you
so
remember the name of the teacher? Any of the teachers' names?
I can tell you that it was a theologian who came from Holy Cross
Cross.
to teach us, because by that age we were more serious in our
Yes.
Sunday school studies. And you mentioned Goya. Yes, I was a member of the first Goya, and in those days, the parents were in charge of the Goya. And they would do things, I remember, craft evenings. I remember down in that basement area putting on various skits that had to do with the Bible, or reading in Greek, or even doing some Greek dancing in those days. And I did want to mention some of those early Goyans, because you know, Professor, that many of these people are still parishioners today,
Correct.
which is
Yes.
quite remarkable to me. So the ones I remember were Cindy and Joanne Tremas, and Cindy Tremas is now Stanton. She married
Yes.
Bill Stanton, who was another Goyan. Thalia Pananides, Elaine Panagopoulos, now Elaine Ward, who has
Yes.
been on the parish council. Athena Stavropoulos, now Athena Pappas, very active for years in the church. Her husband's still in the choir. Nikki Dadiskus, now Stornaras,
yes.
who is Miss Philoptoros here,
Yes.
as I call her.
She still is in charge. Yes.
Yes. Greg and Stevie Loomis, Stephan and Peter Bassett, and of course Peter Bassett is responsible for this lovely new church that we have, for the building of it. Tony and John Decaneus, Jimmy Kritzis, and Donna Harris.
This wonderful list.
Yeah.
I have heard many of these names, but I'm glad that you
Yeah.
put them up. I hope to find most of them to talk to.
Yes, we also have founded a Greek school, and it did
Yes.
not take place here in the church. It took place about 3 blocks away at the home of Angelo and Aliki Bassett. We would meet in the dining room, and there was a student at BU from Greece, a woman who would come out to be our teacher.
And what happened when you moved to this to the first version of this church, which
Uh,
was 1972.
yes.
A little
Well,
modernist.
by then I was in college and just
Right.
getting married.
Where did you get married?
I did not get married in this church. I got married in the cathedral, which was my first church,
Right.
and my grandfather, Arthur Stavropoulos, had been very active in the cathedral. He had laid one of the cornerstones, and in 1920 he was one of the early presidents. And my husband's parents, Bill and Virginia Tryant, had been married in the cathedral,
Oh,
so we had a lot.
Yes.
So we were married in the cathedral, but then when we had our children, both were christened in this church, one by Father Gallos, one
Yes.
by Father Manicus. Bill was an altar boy here. One of our grandchildren has been christened here, and a son and daughter-in-law married by Father Cremidas, and funerals taken place, etc.
Now, yes, go ahead. Do you have, okay, I can help. Do you have any anecdotes of the life of the parish? Any funny stories? Any
Well,
hard stories? Tough?
Yes. I'm going to hark back to that original village church
Yes.
first, because I was concentrating on that, my memories. There are several events I remember there. One was the naming of the church.
Yes.
That took place in the downstairs parish hall, set up like an auditorium, and on the stage were Father Bluhuros and a moderator. I don't remember who he was. I was 13 in the audience. But the way the church was named, there was bidding. You could suggest any name you wanted, but you had to bring up either a check or a pledge with that naming.
Nobody cheated, right?
I hope not. So there were many, many names at first, and eventually they were whittled down to two, Saint Sophia and Saint Demetrius. And I'm pretty sure that it was Harry Angelus, the father of Mary Philopoulos, who was sat on Saint Sophia. And then there were several Jimmies who were sat on Saint Demetrius. The one I knew best was Jimmy Salas, but I think there were several others. And at the end, the bidding became quite spirited, and one would go up, and just as it was going to be named,
what
the
a
other
great
would
story,
whip up. So you know the outcome of that
Yes.
story. Two sad events. The first funeral I ever attended was of George Samelis, a young parishioner, the husband of Tuli Samelis. I was 16 at the time. And also, there was the death of a baby, the Atzilis baby. And what we did after worship, we went out to the right-hand side of the driveway where there
Yes.
was a lawn, and we planted a tree in memory of that baby. Then we started expanding and growing large, and I do remember we were going to have a Glendy, but there was not room anymore for a dance in the parish hall. So we went to Norumbega Park, to a function room overlooking the river where the
Yes.
Marriott Hotel is now, and had our Glendy there. And then I remember, and this brings us to the new church, the buying of land in Newton on the intersection of Route 16 and 128.
Correct.
And that land we must have owned for a couple of years, I'm thinking. And then I heard that there was another group that had found land in Weston that might be more suitable.
So I
and
remember that this was never
that's
used, that first.
how this church came
Yes.
about. And I've served on a lot of Philoptochos committees in
Yes.
this church, but two things I remember in particular. One was we had this enormous Greek festival called Megafest,
Mega.
and thousands of people came. We had to have parking over at Weston High School and everything. But what I remember is sitting in the kitchen and buttering layer after layer of phyllo dough for the
absolutely.
baklava.
That's the way to do it.
And another time we had a Christmas festival with different tables set up, selling and offering different items. And I was put in charge of the candy table. So Presbytera Effie Manicus
Effie,
said
yes.
to me, I know of a wholesale candy store in Natick, and the two of us went out there, and we were like little kids in Charlie's Chocolate Factory, tasting all the candy canes and the ribbon candy. So we did. We brought the candy back, and I feel very fortunate to have worshipped under all the priests whose names I mentioned, and especially Father Cremidas today. And it's also been a very warm and comforting and a spiritually uplifting experience to have been a member of this wonderful parish for 60 years.
Wonderful.